The mountains were her only companion. They said the widow up there was cold as stone, living off snowmelt and silence. But one winter, when she found a starving boy collapsed by her woodpile, she couldn't turn him away. He was half frozen, half wild eyes, too old for his years. She fed him, clothed him, and taught him to work the land. Seasons passed, and the boy became a man, his strength matched only by his loyalty to her. The neighbors whispered, called it strange, shameful. But one evening, beneath the amber glow of the hearth, he looked at her with quiet certainty and said, "You saved my life. Now let me give you mine." And from that moment on, the widow wasn't alone anymore. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The winter came down harder than any she could remember, a living thing with claws of ice that scraped at the windows and howled through the eaves. The widow's cabin sat alone on the ridge, half buried beneath drifts that reached the windowsills. Its roof bowed under the weight of snow that refused to melt. Inside, the air hung heavy with wood smoke and fear. She worked through the hours without rest, hauling water from the frozen creek, splitting logs with hands raw and red, patching the roof where the wind tore at it. And through it all, she kept glancing toward the corner where the boy lay on her cot, his breath shallow and rattling, his skin waxy beneath the flicker of firelight. He had come to her doorstep like a ghost, nothing but bone and frost, his eyes open but seeing nothing. She had thought him dead until his lips moved, whispering something she couldn't catch. Now, weeks later, his voice was stronger, though the cough still took him some nights so fierce it left streaks of red on the rag she pressed to his mouth. She told herself she'd taken him in out of duty, not mercy. The mountains didn't forgive weakness, and neither did she. But each time he stirred, trying to rise and failing, she found herself whispering his name like a prayer she didn't remember learning. She fed him broth made from the last of her stores, poured warmth into him spoon by spoon, and when he slept, she sat beside the hearth, mending his torn coat by lamplight. Her hands trembled sometimes not from age, but from the quiet terror that she'd been too late. At night, when the storm screamed outside and the world disappeared beneath white, she knelt by the window, watching the snow drift higher, and prayed, not for company, not for forgiveness, but for strength. Strength to keep him breathing, strength to keep believing. The days blurred together, a rhythm of survival, fire, water, wood, breath. When his fever broke, she didn't weep. She just sat back, wiped her brow, and muttered thanks to no one in particular. But he reached for her hand then, his fingers shaking as they wrapped around hers, and said, "You didn't let me die." She almost pulled away, startled by the warmth of his touch. By the way his voice, still hoarse, filled the silence she'd worn like armor for years. "I couldn't," she said, the words catching in her throat. She didn't tell him that she'd seen death too many times, buried too many faces, and refused to watch another one fade before her. As the snow deepened and the nights grew longer, she began to feel something shift inside her, a small defiance against the emptiness that had claimed her since the day the mountains took her husband. She rose earlier, worked harder, and when she heard him chopping wood outside one morning weakly, clumsily, but alive, she felt something bloom in her chest she'd thought long dead. Pride, maybe, or hope. The mountain air still bit cruel and sharp, but the sound of his axe rang like a heartbeat through the cold. That night, she stoked the fire higher, and for the first time in years, she caught herself humming an old tune her mother once sang, a tune about spring, about thaw, about everything that still dared to live after the winter. When the first patches of earth appeared beneath the melting snow, the widow almost didn't recognize the world. The white silence that had smothered her cabin for months began to loosen its grip, dripping from the eaves, trickling down the stones, breathing life back into the land that had slept under ice. The air smelled different, wet pine and thawing soil, and with it came a strange, cautious hope that she didn't trust. The boy, no longer the frail ghost she'd dragged in from the storm, rose each morning before the sun, his steps unsteady at first but driven by something fierce inside him. He'd grown stronger with the light, his shoulders broadening, his skin darkening from work and sun, though the sickness had left its mark in the thinness of his frame. She watched him quietly as he learned the rhythm of the land, how to mend a fence line without wasting a nail, how to split a log with one clean strike instead of three, how to read the sky for rain. He moved with the awkward diligence of someone learning not just labor, but purpose. Each task he completed seemed to mean more than survival. It was redemption, payment for a debt she'd never asked him to repay. "You don't owe me anything," she'd tell him when he pushed himself too far, when she caught him working through dusk with sweat dripping from his brow. He'd just smile, that rare, quiet smile that made him look older than his years. "Maybe not," he'd say, "but I owe the world for giving me another chance." She didn't argue after that. In truth, she didn't know how to. Somewhere between the long winter nights and the first green shoots of spring, the cabin had changed. It felt warmer now, fuller, his laughter filling the corners where her silence used to live. Sometimes, when she caught him singing softly while repairing the barn door, she'd stop herself from listening too long, afraid of what she might feel if she let her heart remember how to want. She told herself he was still just a boy, though each day his face grew sharper, his voice deeper, his gaze steadier. He never looked at her with pity, only respect, and something else, something she didn't dare name. One evening, after a long day mending the south fence, he brought her a handful of wildflowers he'd found pushing through the thawing ground. "They reminded me of you," he said shyly. She frowned, half amused, half disarmed. "I'm no flower," she said, brushing the dirt from her hands. "No," he answered, holding her gaze. "You're the ground they grow from." She turned away quickly, pretending to tend the fire, but her chest felt tight for the rest of the night. She caught herself thinking about the way he'd said it without charm or intention, just truth. And when he smiled at her across the dinner table, something deep inside her stirred, quiet but undeniable, like the first green shoot pushing through frost. She told herself it was pride, gratitude, maybe even affection, but in the way his eyes lingered, she saw the reflection of something stronger. The mountain wind still howled some nights, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded alive. And though she never said it aloud, she began to realize that maybe she needed him just as much as he needed her. The town sat crouched in the valley like a gossiping old woman, its crooked streets and faded storefronts forever hungry for stories that weren't their own. When the widow rode down the mountain that spring, the thaw still fresh in her hair and her cheeks touched pink from the wind, every head seemed to turn her way. The sound of her horse's hooves on the boardwalk echoed too loudly, too clearly, as if announcing her arrival to those who had already decided who she was. She kept her back straight, her chin high, her eyes fixed ahead on the general store, but she could feel their gazes sharp as thorns, soft as pity piercing through the wool of her shawl. A few nodded politely, those who remembered her from before she disappeared into the mountains after her husband's death. Others only whispered, the kind of whispers that cling to a person long after the sound fades. "There she is," one voice hissed. "The widow who lives with that boy." Another snorted. "Boy, hell. He's near grown now, ain't he?" Laughter followed low, knowing, cruel. She pretended not to hear, her steps steady as she tied the horse to the post and entered the store. The air inside smelled of kerosene and coffee grounds, but even that comfort couldn't wash away the sting of their words. The storekeeper, Mr. Hensley, greeted her with a stiff smile. "Been a long winter up there, ma'am," he said, his tone somewhere between curiosity and concern. "Heard you had company." "A hand to help with the chores," she replied evenly, setting a list on the counter. "That's all." He nodded, though his eyes lingered longer than they should, as if searching her face for the truth behind the lie he didn't believe. When she stepped outside again, her basket heavy with flour, salt, and coffee, the air felt heavier too. Across the street, a pair of women stood by the milliner's window, their whispers slicing through the wind. "It ain't natural," one said. "A widow and a stray boy, alone up there in those hills. Sin's what it is," the other muttered, "or madness." Her throat tightened, but she didn't slow her pace. She'd learned long ago that silence was the only answer worth giving to small minds. Still, the words followed her all the way back up the trail, clinging to the rhythm of her horse's hooves, echoing between the trees until they seemed part of the mountain air itself. When she reached the cabin, the boy was there waiting, mending a gate with his sleeves rolled up and the sun catching the strength in his shoulders. He looked up as she rode in, his face brightening at the sight of her. And for a moment the weight of town and talk fell away. "You were gone long," he said, taking the basket from her hands. "Snowmelts flooded the creek," she answered, setting her gloves aside, but he caught the shadow in her eyes. "They talked, didn't they?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Let them," he said quietly, his voice steady, older than his years. "They don't know you like I do." She looked at him then, at the calm certainty in his gaze, and something in her chest softened. "No," she said, almost to herself. "They don't." That night, as the fire crackled and the mountains outside gleamed silver under the moon, she sat by the window, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. The words from town still echoed faintly in her mind, but for the first time, they didn't wound. Let them whisper, she thought. The mountains had their own stories, and the truth, though quiet, was stronger than the noise below. The years slipped by like water running over stone, shaping them both in ways neither spoke of but both felt deeply. The mountain became their whole world, its moods and seasons dictating the rhythm of their days, its silence the language they had learned to share. The boy grew into a man, his frame tall and broad from years of labor, his movements sure and purposeful, every motion carved by work and weather. The widow, her hair streaked now with silver, still rose before dawn, her body lean and strong from a life that demanded more endurance than comfort. They rarely spoke, but they didn't need to. Their understanding lived in the quiet between words, in the way he'd fetch wood before she asked, or how she'd set aside an extra plate when he returned from hunting late. Together they rebuilt what the harsh years had taken. The fences stood straight again. The barn no longer leaned. The soil they'd nursed from stone now bloomed with crops that fed them through winter. When the storms came, they faced them side by side, wordless, unyielding. On clear evenings, when the light stretched long and gold across the valley, he'd sit on the porch mending tools while she spun thread beside him. The only sounds, the wind and the faint, rhythmic creak of the chair beneath her. Sometimes he'd glance her way, catching the outline of her face against the fading sun, the lines of age softened by peace, the strength in her hands unbroken, and he'd feel something stir in his chest, something too sacred to name. She'd catch him looking, once in a while, but never scolded, never turned away. Perhaps she felt it too, that strange and tender current that bound them not of blood, nor of duty, but of something older, something the mountain itself seemed to bless. In town, they would still whisper about her, about them, though she hadn't been down the ridge in years. That widow and her stray, they'd say, shaking their heads, but their voices had lost their sting. She no longer cared what they thought. The mountain had claimed her long ago, and with it came freedom from judgment, from the world's small cruelties. She'd lost a husband once to war, and with him the softness of her youth. But the years spent beside this man, this boy she'd once pulled from death, had given her something different, something deeper. They worked as one body, moving through the seasons like a steady heartbeat, neither leading nor following, simply existing together in the quiet truth of survival and respect. When she grew ill one winter and the fever took her strength, he sat by her bedside through every night, his hand cool against her brow, his eyes burning with a worry he never voiced. "You should rest," she'd whisper. He'd only shake his head. "Not while you need me." And when spring returned again, thawing the world into life, she would watch him from the window splitting logs, shoulders glistening in the sun, his face calm, certain, and she'd feel something like pride twist warm in her chest. She never called him son, and he never called her mother. But there were other words the world didn't have names for, words that lived in silence and breath and the quiet miracle of two souls learning to belong where no one else could. Their bond was not spoken but built, planted, hammered, mended, and lived, and it stood as firm and unbreakable as the mountain itself. The stranger came at dusk, a tall, dust-covered man with sunburnt skin and the restless air of someone who'd crossed more miles than he could count. He rode up slow, tipping his hat in greeting, and asked if they needed another hand for the season. The widow, wary but fair, offered him supper and a place to sleep in the barn, and he accepted with a nod of gratitude. During the meal, he spoke between bites of drought in the southern towns, of cattle thieves, of the price of grain, and the coming storms. His voice carried the scent of distant places, and though the widow listened in silence, the younger man leaned forward, drawn by the sound of a world beyond their mountains. Then, without meaning to wound, the stranger mentioned a town's name, a small settlement far south, where fever had swept through 5 winters ago. "Took near everyone," he said, shaking his head. "Whole families gone." The young man froze, his spoon suspended halfway to his mouth. "Did you say Los Perdidos?" The traveler nodded, his tone still casual, unaware of the weight he'd just dropped into the room. "Aye, that's the one. You from there?" The man couldn't answer. His eyes had gone distant, unfocused, as if the words themselves had struck him down harder than any blow. The stranger went on talking, but the widow caught the shift, the way her companion's shoulders stiffened, the way the light drained from his face. When the meal was done and the traveler bedded down in the barn, she found the boy, no, the man sitting alone by the hearth, the fire's glow trembling across his features. His hands rested open on his knees, calloused palms gleaming, as though he were holding something fragile that had already slipped through his fingers. The flames reflected in his eyes, and in that light she saw the tears he was too proud to shed. She didn't speak at first. The mountain had taught her that some griefs are best met with silence. Still, after a long while, she stepped closer, her shadow falling across the floorboards, and said quietly, "You heard what he said." He nodded once, jaw tight, voice breaking when he finally spoke. "I thought maybe there was someone left." His breath hitched, raw and uneven. "A brother, a cousin, somebody who'd remember me." The words hung heavy between them, the sound of them breaking something open in her chest. She had known loss like that, the kind that hollows you out and leaves you walking through the days like a ghost. She knelt beside him, slow, her knees creaking against the floor, and laid a hand on his shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it steadied him like a lifeline. "You're not alone," she said softly. He turned toward her, the firelight catching the wetness in his eyes, and for a moment the years between them vanished. There was no widow, no orphan, no mountain between them, just 2 souls bound by the same ache. "You gave me a home when I had none," he whispered. "You're all I've got left." Her throat tightened, her eyes burning, though she fought to keep them clear. "And you," she said, "are all I've got too." The words came out barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of truth. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling low, their shadows flickering against the cabin walls. Outside, the wind rose gently through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and rain. The stranger would leave come morning, and life would go on as before, but something had changed that night, something deep and wordless. For the first time, they both knew it wasn't just survival that kept them bound to each other. It was something stronger, something that, even in silence, felt like belonging. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the high peaks like a living beast, snarling with thunder and hurling sheets of rain that turned the mountain path into a river of mud. By noon the sky was black as twilight, and the wind screamed through the canyon with a sound like the earth itself breaking. They'd seen bad weather before, but this was different, angrier, heavier, as though the mountain had grown tired of their stubborn presence and meant to sweep them clean away. The first roar of the rockslide shook the ground under their feet, a deep, bone-rattling growl that sent the horses bolting and the chickens scattering. She ran outside before he could stop her, skirts whipping around her legs, shouting over the wind that the lower pens would flood if they didn't move the livestock. He caught up to her at the fence line, mud splattering his face, rain soaking his shirt through. "It's too dangerous," he shouted. But she only shook her head, eyes fierce beneath dripping hair. "We don't leave them." And then the second crash came, rocks tumbling from the ridge, a wall of debris tearing through the valley with a sound like the sky collapsing. Together they pushed the gate open, herding terrified animals through the muck toward higher ground. The rain stung their faces, the air thick with dust and lightning. She slipped once, her foot caught in a tangle of roots, and he grabbed her just in time, hauling her up with a strength born of fear. For hours they fought the storm, mud sucking at their boots, the sound of the mountain breaking apart echoing through their chests. By the time they got the last of the cattle to safety, the cabin below was half buried. One wall splintered where the rocks had struck. Smoke from the chimney twisted sideways in the wind, carrying sparks that hissed out in the rain. He turned to her, breathless, mud streaked across his jaw. "It's done," he said. But she shook her head, eyes fixed on the ruins of the barn. The tools we'll need them to rebuild. Before he could protest, she was already moving, her determination burning brighter than the lightning that split the sky. He chased after her, shouting her name, but she ignored him, her steps sure even as the ground trembled underfoot. They reached the barn just as the final wave of wind tore its roof clean away. The door slammed against the wall, nearly striking her, and he threw himself forward, pulling her back into his arms. The world seemed to explode in sound and fury, wood snapping, rain pounding, his heart hammering against her back. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The wind faltered, the rain slowed to a steady patter, and silence settled, a silence heavy with exhaustion and relief. He felt her go limp against him, her strength spent, her breath shallow. "No," he whispered, lifting her face, rain and tears mingling on her skin. "Don't you give out now." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I'm just tired," she murmured, before her eyes fluttered closed. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, her weight light but precious, and carried her through the wreckage. Each step up the muddy slope felt endless, but he didn't stop until they reached what was left of the cabin. Inside, he laid her down by the hearth, the one part still standing, and stoked the fire back to life. As warmth filled the room, he brushed the wet hair from her forehead, his hand lingering there longer than it should have. Outside, the storm's fury faded into a distant murmur, but inside, something far stronger had taken root, a quiet vow, unspoken but certain. Whatever came next, whatever the mountain took or gave, he would not let her face it alone. The days after the storm passed in a blur of smoke and aching bones, the cabin standing half-ruined but stubbornly upright, much like the woman inside it. She lay pale beneath a thin quilt, the lines of her face sharper, her breath shallow but steady. The bandages on her arm were clean, the fever fading, but the exhaustion ran deep, the kind that came not from wounds but from years of carrying the weight of everything alone. He stayed beside her, refusing rest, his chair pulled close to the bed, as if his nearness alone might keep her tethered to the world. Each time she stirred, he was there bringing water, tending the fire, whispering her name when the wind outside grew too loud. On the third night, when the rain had finally stopped and the scent of wet earth drifted through the cracked walls, he sat staring into the low flame, his hands trembling slightly from more than just fatigue. Her eyes fluttered open, soft and unfocused, finding him there like a sentinel carved from worry and devotion. "You should sleep," she whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves. He shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." She tried to smile, but the effort cost her. "You've done enough, boy." At that, something inside him broke quietly, cleanly. "Don't call me that," he said, his voice low but certain. She turned her head toward him, confusion flickering in her tired eyes, but he didn't look away. His hands were clenched in his lap, knuckles white, the words trembling at the edge of his breath. "I'm not leaving," he said again, stronger this time. "Not ever. You gave me a life when I had nothing. You pulled me back when the world was done with me." He leaned forward, the firelight painting his face in gold and shadow. "You're my heart now, not my keeper." The words fell into the space between them, heavy and tender, carrying years of unspoken feeling that neither had dared to name. She stared at him, her lips parting, but no sound came. For so long she had built her heart into stone, convinced it was too late for it to beat again, too late for warmth or want. But hearing him now, so certain, so full of truth, it cracked something open inside her. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and silent, tracing the creases of her face. He reached for her hand, hesitating only once before taking it, his thumb brushing her knuckles as if afraid she might vanish. Her fingers trembled in his, weak but responsive, a silent answer to everything he'd said. "Don't," she managed at last, her voice breaking. "Don't say things you'll regret." But he only shook his head, eyes bright in the flickering light. "I've spent too many years not saying what mattered. Not anymore." For a long time neither spoke. The fire popped softly, the wind sighed against the window, and their hands stayed joined, an unspoken vow held between them like breath. When she finally turned her face toward him, he saw something new in her gaze, not fear, not rejection, but the same fierce tenderness she'd shown when she first dragged him from the snow all those years ago. She wanted to speak, to tell him what stirred in her heart, but the words tangled with her tears, and so she said nothing at all. Instead, she let her hand rest in his, her silence no longer a wall, but a bridge. And for him, that was enough. He leaned back, eyes never leaving her, and for the first time since the storm began, the mountain felt still like it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The news spread like wildfire carried on the dry summer wind, reaching every porch and parlor long before the widow herself ever came down the mountain again. It began with a trader who'd stopped at their homestead, seen the young man fixing the roof while she stood beside him, laughter in her voice, sunlight in her hair, and the unmistakable ease between them that spoke of something deeper than companionship. By the time the tale reached the valley, it had grown twisted and poisonous, told with wagging tongues and smirking lips. "The widow's gone mad," they said at the mercantile. "Taking her straight a husband, after raising him like a son." At the saloon, men scoffed and spat tobacco, calling it shameful, unholy. The pastor, a thin man with more pride than grace, stood in the pulpit that Sunday and warned the congregation about the sickness that comes when loneliness and sin take root in the same heart. The women in their Sunday dresses nodded, eyes sharp with self-righteousness, whispering as she passed through town days later to buy flour and feed. "Does she not fear God?" one hissed. "Does she not have shame?" But the widow heard them all and kept walking, her back straight, her hands steady on the reins. She had lived too long with storms and silence to fear the noise of petty hearts. When she stepped into the store, the room went still. The clerk hesitated before serving her, his politeness strained. "You've heard what they're saying," he muttered, unable to meet her eyes. "I have," she replied evenly. "And they'll keep saying it long after we're dust. That's how folks are." Her calmness unsettled him. He fumbled with her order, finally blurting, "The pastor won't bless it. Says it ain't right." She laid the coins on the counter, her voice quiet but unshakable. "God don't need his permission to see what's in our hearts." When she turned to leave, the room exhaled a dozen whispers blooming behind her like weeds, but she didn't so much as flinch. Outside, the air smelled of dust and judgment. The young man waited by the wagon, his expression clouded with worry. "They'll never accept us," he said under his breath. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady as the mountains behind them. "I stopped needing their acceptance a long time ago," she said. "They didn't feed me when I was hungry. They didn't mourn when I buried my husband. They don't get to tell me what love should look like." Her voice carried a quiet strength that left him breathless. He reached for her hand, hesitating only a moment before lacing his fingers through hers, right there in the middle of the street for all to see. Gasps rippled through the bystanders gathered at the general store porch, but she didn't let go. "You sure?" he asked softly. "Once we do this, there's no going back." She turned toward him then, the corner of her mouth lifting into a faint smile that was equal parts sorrow and defiance. "Son, I've lived half my life looking back," she said. "This time, I'm riding forward." They left town that day with their supplies and their heads held high, the mountain road rising before them like a promise. Behind them, the voices still buzzed small, bitter, and fading with distance. Ahead, the wind swept clean through the pines, whispering of freedom and firelight, and the kind of love that didn't bow to the world's scorn. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was setting, painting the sky in red and gold. He looked at her, awe in his eyes, and for a moment, she looked back, not as a widow, not as a savior, but as a woman finally unafraid to live. The mountain, it seemed, had taught her its most sacred truth, that even stone can hold warmth when touched by enough courage. The day they wed dawned clear and sharp, the air so crisp it stung the lungs, the sky a boundless sweep of blue that seemed to stretch forever. The storm of gossip below had long since lost its power. They'd climbed beyond it, to a place where the world's judgment could not reach. She woke early that morning, her hands calm as she braided her hair and pinned it with the silver comb she'd once worn on her wedding day long ago, a relic of another life, another love buried deep beneath the years. But as she looked into the small mirror, its surface warped and spotted, she saw no ghost of that woman staring back. This reflection was older, stronger, forged by loneliness, labor, and the quiet fire that still lived in her eyes. Outside, he was already waiting, dressed in his cleanest shirt, the collar rough with wear but the fabric pressed with care. He'd shaved that morning, his jawline raw and pink from the effort, and in his hand he held a small band of braided horsehair, the only ring he could offer, one he'd made himself during the long nights rebuilding the cabin. "You sure?" he asked as she stepped outside, though the question trembled more from awe than doubt. She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth softening. "I've been sure for a long time," she said. They walked together up the ridge where the land opened wide to the horizon, the wind tugging at their clothes, the sun spilling gold across the valley below. The mountains stood silent around them, ancient, watchful witnesses carved from time itself. The sound of the creek murmured somewhere below, a song older than words. When they reached the clearing, she turned toward him, her skirts brushing against the grass, her breath visible in the cool air. There were no flowers, no guests, no preacher's voice to bind them, only the world itself, vast and listening. He took her hands, calloused palms rough against hers, and for a long moment they simply stood there, saying nothing, letting the wind speak for them. Finally, he drew a breath and began, his voice quiet but steady. "When you found me, I was nothing less than nothing. You gave me a name, a place, and the will to live again. I don't have fine words, but I swear this. I'll spend the rest of my days giving back what you gave me." She felt her throat tighten, the world blurring at the edges. "And I," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion she'd long kept buried, "swear to never again face the world alone. You were sent to me when I'd forgotten how to care for anything but ghosts." Her hand lifted to his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, rough with stubble, real and alive. "You're my proof that even the coldest mountain can thaw." He smiled, then small, unguarded, the kind of smile that belonged only to truth, and slipped the braided band onto her finger. It wasn't gold, but it was strong, woven tight, just like the life they'd built from hardship and faith. The wind rose suddenly, sweeping through the clearing like a blessing, carrying pine needles and sunlight around them in a shimmering dance. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried out, its wings cutting across the bright sky. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, and the world seemed to still. The only sound, the quiet rhythm of their breathing. No witnesses but the mountain. No blessing but the Sunday. No need for words, because the earth itself seemed to understand their vows were carved not in parchment or prayer, but in the soil beneath their feet, in every scar, every storm, every moment they'd chosen each other against the odds. When they finally walked back down the ridge, hand in hand, the sky was deepening into amber, and the wind followed them like a hymn. And though no one would ever sing of their union, the mountain would remember, because love that survives silence and winter does not need the world to see it to be eternal. The years rolled by like slow-moving clouds over the peaks, and the cabin on the ridge became part of the mountain itself, weathered, steadfast, alive with the scent of pine and the sound of laughter carried on the wind. The widow's hair, once streaked with silver, turned white as snow, and the lines around her eyes deepened with the softness of peace. The man, no longer the boy she'd once rescued, carried the quiet strength of someone who had built his world with his own hands, every scar and wrinkle a testament to work done with love. Together they tended their land through seasons of plenty and hardship, planting in the thaw, harvesting in the heat, and sitting side by side through the long winters, the fire's glow painting warmth over the years they'd shared. The townsfolk below still talked. Sometimes people always did, but their voices had lost their venom. Now when a traveler came through asking about the widow and her mountain man, the old shopkeeper would just smile and say, "They're still up there, proof that kindness can turn into forever." The pastor who once condemned them had long since passed, replaced by a younger man who'd heard the stories and found in them more grace than any sermon could offer. Children whispered about the couple on the ridge like they were a legend. Some said the mountain kept them young, others that their love had bound them to the land. On rare trips to town, they'd ride down together, her in a faded shawl, him in his old hat, both of them carrying that same quiet dignity that made even the cruelest tongue falter. No one dared speak ill of them anymore. The years had turned scandal into story, story into truth. At home, their life was simple, a rhythm of mornings spent watching the sun climb the peaks and evenings wrapped in the hush of dusk. He'd carved her a rocking chair one winter, smoothing the wood with the same care he'd once given to her wounds, and she'd sewn him a coat thick enough to outlast any storm. They didn't need words much. Their silence had become its own language, fluent in glances and gestures, the way she touched his arm when she passed, the way he left wildflowers on the table each spring. Sometimes, when the wind rose, she'd look out across the valley and see the faint trails of smoke from distant ranches, remembering a world that had long since moved on. "Do you ever wish we'd gone back?" she asked him once, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He shook his head, smiling that slow, familiar smile. "Back where?" he said. "Everything worth going to is right here." And she believed him, because it was true. The mountain had given them solitude, but they had given it meaning. As the years deepened and their steps grew slower, the two became inseparable from the land they'd built a life upon. And when one cold morning she didn't rise from her bed, he sat beside her, holding her hand until the sun reached the window. He buried her on the ridge, beneath the wildflowers she'd loved, where the world stretched open and endless around her. He stayed there until his own breath joined the wind, and the cabin fell silent again. But still, the locals say, when the snow melts and the grass begins to stir, you can hear laughter in the wind above the valley, soft, warm, eternal. And if you look up at sunset, you might just see two figures standing together on the ridge, hand in hand, proof that love, once found, can outlast even time itself.